Greetings, friends of the original Shepherd's Rod message, and welcome to the Universal Publishing Association YouTube channel. I'm your host, Brother Eric. Today we're going to pick up a topic that's critical because, amongst professed Davidians, there's a lot of confusion. There's been for decades about this idea of what is the storehouse and where's God's headquarters and so forth. Part of the way to solve that problem is to understand our past, our history. And what we're going to look at today in particular is this whole idea of using a portion of Ezekiel 47 about going east. The idea that we have to have a headquarters located in the United States on the East Coast. Yes or no? So that's what we're going to dive into today and look at some of the origin of this teaching. And ask the question, does it come from the original rod or does it come from somebody else? We're going to find out. And part of the reason for this was prompted by a request from some brethren that are in Thailand who are trying to sort this all out. And they were going to have an interaction with brethren from Waco, who, of course, are arguing that the fountain isn't open and that going east has nothing to do with the movement of the storehouse, God's storehouse in the past. So they were going to have to deal with that. And so around the Pagan High Day, I think it was December 24, 25, we had a special meeting where we kind of dug into some more details. It was an open Zoom call, and I recorded part of that and put it here. And a lot of people found that useful. Got some information, but some follow-up to that is it kind of agitated my mind to go back and look at some documents and address this question, well, where did this teaching come from anyway? This whole idea of going east, and that we have to apply it after the death of Brother Houteff, and it has to do with something about having a headquarters either in South Carolina or New York, because that's common amongst those groups. And I've known this for a while, but I just hadn't re-examined it. So I went back and looked at some original documents, and I want to show you some stuff today that definitively identifies where this comes from, and furthermore, is it relevant today as far as addressing the idea of a storehouse or a headquarters having to be located in the United States. So these are really crucial issues, and so this detail will help us sort this out. So I invite you to come on in. We'll do a short PowerPoint here. And we'll begin with this thumbnail, which is the going east question. After 1955, this is the crucial thing. Is it in the original rod or not? And we're going to look at the question, are these illustrations inspired? They, of course, are done by none other than that gentleman, Don Adair. And this whole idea or arguments being put up for moving the storehouse from Southern California to Waco, Texas, which happened in 1935, but then the idea that there has to be a headquarters or an association after the death of Brother Houteff, and in this case, Salem in 1970, and then using Ezekiel River with his illustration about movement of the headquarters 3 times across the United States. So that comes from Don Adair, but the question is this part of the original rod? So that's why we want to look at some documents where this comes from in a timeline. So this is significant. So come on in and join us as we're going to look at some documentation. And all of this, by the way, is going to be available to anybody that wants it. You can contact us by email, text, or WhatsApp, and I'll share all these documents I'll show in the study. So just to summarize, how do they deal with Ezekiel 47 today? Of course, there is not a united platform. Everybody has a different idea. This is just summarizing. Basically, Salem and Mountaindale associations more or less believe in an eastward movement of the storehouse headquarters. And they use that to justify their locations, in the case of Salem, since 1970, up till the current day, and then in the case of Mountaindale, since they joined with Houteff in 1986, and they still exist today. So they tend to support the idea of an eastward movement of the headquarters storehouse. On the other hand, other associations like the International GADSDA, that's under that was started by Wanda Bloom. Now, she's passed away, but this is located out in Red Bluff, California. They're still led by a man named Anthony Dugo. Then you got New Waco, we call it, that was split from Mount Dale in 1991 under Norman Archer. That was his thing. The 11th Hour Church, Lennox Sam, which is an offshoot of Waco, all argue that the fountain will not be open until the kingdom, and that the eastward course of the stream has nothing to do with the movement of God's storehouse. So we have documents to prove all of that. So they stand in opposition to Salem and Mountaindale. Now, a newer group called Pre-11th Hour Ministry that started in 2022 relocates, I guess, their headquarters or whatever they want to call it, back in Texas, and now is in a theological conundrum regarding the headquarters storehouse issue. What they tend to do in covering their history is they overlook the significance of what happened in the split in 1994 and 2005. These are significant, and I will show documents to prove the case here shortly. And then finally, Bashan tends to not pay much attention at all to Ezekiel 47, and Trevor Bingham himself told me that. So that's kind of a general summary of where Davidian groups stand on this. We're going to go review some history about movement or relocation of storehouse. And of course, under Brother Houteff's tenure while he was alive, Waco, Texas, from 1935 to his death in 1955, there was no dispute. That was the location of the headquarters, GADSDA, and Universal Publishing, which is part of the organizational structure. So that nobody disputes. Now, Florence took over the message and tried to dismantle it, hijacked it, and usurped. But God had faithful Davidians to oppose her apostasy, and they reorganized in 1961. So this is a fundamentally crucial meeting. And fortunately, we have the documents that are published, what they call a pre-session and a session code, documenting about what was discussed, who was there, who became leaders, what were the issues at hand. So we have complete scans of these documents. And so this is where we're getting our information from. This group, they tended to, their principal mandate after this was to reestablish publishing of the original tract literature, because Florence had corrupted it, and then train Bible workers. And that fundamental mandate still stands today. We adhere to that. But there's an interesting part in here about why did they reorganize back in California and not Texas? Good question. Well, within that, one of those symbolic codes, we're going to highlight this section on page 8 at the bottom, starting in the yellow highlight. The issue of the location of their headquarters was crucial. So I'll read that and then over to the next page under the between the red bars. So this paragraph is significant. Let's read it. It says, early on the agenda came the concern as to the location of headquarters. This proved to be the most difficult problem of the session. So this was the big issue in the day. Still a big issue today in 2024. Continuing on, it says, some were of the opinion that it must, in view of one or two statements in the rod, be the Lord's will that we somehow gain control of Old Mount Carmel, that we might carry on and finish the work from there. Now remember, at this time, Old Mount Carmel had been completely sold off by 1957. Brother Houteff ordered that in 10 Symbolic Code number 1, sell off first a part, then the whole, because the Waco city limits engulfed that original property, so it was no longer in a rural location. So that's all documented. And then Florence used the money to buy new Mount Carmel out there where the Branch Davidian David Koresh thing took place. So they were trying to figure out, well, how could we regain control of this territory, the original 375 acres? Well, it was now within the city limits, and it was filled with, high-class neighborhood with schools and shopping malls. And and so forth. So it's like that was kind of a problem. So it's interesting how God worked to resolve this crisis, because the thinking is, oh, that's a sacred, holy place, right? No, well, it was a place in history, but the idea that we have to be there forever was certainly not recorded or documented in history or in the records. So let's continue on. It says, a study. So how'd they resolve this crisis? The sentiment, well, a lot of them went, hey, we got to go back to a portion of Waco, but it didn't happen. Here's how it worked. It says, a study from the Bible and the rod was presented to us by Brother Bingham, proving conclusively that there are 3 places of spiritual pasture where God's people are to feed, and making reference to Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2, page 243, paragraph 2. Very important reference. Read that if you aren't familiar with it. The study went on to show that since the Carmel of the rod, Old Mount Carmel, is no more, and since Gilead is the kingdom, see Jeremiah 51:8 and Jeremiah 46, verse 11 and 12, we are therefore now in the Bashan period and must accordingly get our meat in due season from the rod in Bashan. This entire study will be published as soon as possible. So this is where this whole idea of going from Carmel to Bashan came out. It came out of the brain of M.J. Bingham. Okay. Now, what's interesting is recorded here is that was enough to sway the people that they didn't have to relocate back in Waco. And they voted and decided to reorganize back in California. So this is an absolute recorded fact. Now, people will object and stand up and say, well, oh, that's the teaching of Bingham. Yes, but this was a new thing. Nobody knew about this. So this was sprung on them, and most people it seemed reasonable, and they went for it. They didn't have time to analyze and pick apart the problems, okay? And the problem in a nutshell, if you're not familiar with this, we have a whole video and a written study about Carmel, Bashan, and Gilead versus Mount Carmel Center. The issue is that Bingham made the association that Mount Carmel Center, the physical location, Waco, Texas, was synonymous or the same as Carmel pasture. And that when Florence sold off the property, that was the withering of Carmel. It's a deep logical fallacy with that, because Mount Carmel Center is different than Carmel pasture. And if you don't believe me, ask a Bashan brethren. You'll say, I'll ask them, what's the difference between Carmel pasture and Mount Carmel Center? And they'll say, it's the same. And I'm like, no, they're not. Would you like to have a Bible study? And you can prove this from the rod. Okay, so the selling off of Old Mount Carmel Center was, of course, ordered by God, but that was not the withering of Carmel pasture. But back in the day, this was the argument that God allowed to convince them not to go back to Waco. So that's an irrefutable fact. Now, we don't endorse Bashan theology because later, of course, people didn't know at this time that the whole agenda of Bingham. Now we have the benefit of history to look back and look at that study and all of their arguments, and we clearly can conclude that Bashan is a counterfeit. Their doctrines are corrupted and adulterated. But this is important history to know and understand. So if you'd like to read all of this, you can request a copy of the documents and read them for yourself. Now, at that time, no mention of Ezekiel 47 or going east. 0. 1961. Now, let's go forward. So they reorganized back in California and existed there. The original publishing work, there was a couple movements, but all within that area of Southern California. But the big move was, okay, in 1970, they decided to relocate the publishing work, or the headquarters as they considered it, to Salem, South Carolina. Why did they do that, and on what basis? That's the key question. So fortunately, we have records of this, Salem Symbolic Codes, pre-session and session code, and we have digital scans of this, and this tells us the reason why. And we can ask that question, is it on the basis of Ezekiel 47 or going east or not? Now, the assumption that's brainwashed into people that come from Salem and Mountaindale that it was, and I used to believe that. However, it's not true. Let's just look at what the sources say. Now, I've been aware of this for a while, but I just never could quite harmonize it all. But let's just let the record speak. So this comes from the pre-session code. Some words from the vice president. That was Brother Harry Warden, H.T. Warden. And I'm going to read you the two paragraphs with the under the yellow bar highlights. And this is clear. Just read these and analyze on what basis did they decide to move to Salem. So let's read it. Early in the year 1969, the council decided that most all avenues were closed for any real progress in Southern California. Of course, they'd been there for almost a decade. We saw no way to improve the situation, for all doors were closed against the message. Many Davidians have gone back to the church, some backsliders, apostasy. Some have completely apostatized. The church has pronounced the rod as false and is a dead movement. That came out in 1962. Signs of the Times, R.L. Odom, pronouncing the rod as dead. That most all Laodiceans were willing to believe it, these lies, cooked up by church leaders. This made it almost impossible to break through the barriers of prejudice, of course. Therefore, we began to look for a new location. First, we searched through southeastern California for a suitable location, but we found nothing we could handle. As the old rest home in South Carolina was still standing, and on an invitation by the brethren there, of course, there was a group of Davidians that were started there back. They built that rest home in 1946. We have this all documented. So the Smith family, they had 14 children. Okay, so some of them were Davidians, so they were still there in communication, and they invited them. We decided to make it a branch office for our publishing establishment. We're going to move the publishing over there. Having heard that everything was cheaper there compared to California, definitely, and that we could print for much less money, we decided to investigate the situation. Brother Sidney Smith, who was the husband of Bonnie Smith, who was a trained Bible worker, a hunter under Brother Houteff, was sent to spy out the land. He brought forth a favorable report, and all was well, and that we could lease the property for an indefinite period. Okay, part of that rest home. Owing to our crowded condition here in Vista, we now had closed a printing office and had stored all the equipment in garages. We had Brother Smith take the printing press and most of the other equipment to Salem and to the rest home. Before moving the press, we decided to pay off all indebtedness on the same, a total amount of several $1,000s. We have numerous other machines costing many hundreds of dollars. Besides this, we spent much money for paper to do all the printing. This is where much of your money is gone. So they move all the printing from Southern California to Salem. What were the reasons why? Just analyze it. Did it have anything to do with going east? No, didn't say so. It had to do with economic reasons and the rising prejudice from being in that part of California. Those were the reasons. And when I first read this years ago, I said, I kept looking, there's got to be, they did it on the basis of Ezekiel 47. No. That idea got into my head because I studied with Don Adair for a while and then later got involved with Mountaindale. And that was where the idea came from, but it didn't come from the records of history because it doesn't say so. So this is significant. This is really significant. Pay attention. Now, there's more data on this. Here's a document called Davidian, the Inside Report. Now, this was published by Ukaipa, probably about 1975, 1976, to oppose the teachings of Wanda Bloom, who was coming up with crazy doctrines about 7 movements and all of this. And so this was to oppose that. But here, inside of this is some very important documentation. Okay. And so we're going to look at, in here, they have records of the various sessions that they held during the 1960s, all the way up till the mid-1970s. So here, I want to highlight this one on page 12 of this document, a session that was held 1969, August 30-31. Notice he only took 2 days. So I'm going to read under that yellow bar there. It says, the next session was held in August 30-31, 1969 at 2020 Edge Hill Drive, Vista, California. This is where they used to publish the literature in the 60s. Brother Ward requested that Don Adair act as chairman and Wanda Adair. Now, Don Adair has been married and divorced twice, and so he was on his third marriage. So Wanda Adair was his second wife. They divorced, and they each accused each other of adultery, and then they both remarried. She later became Wanda Bloom, and Don Adair, of course, married another woman, Marilyn Adair. So, this is some Davidian soap opera, if you will. But at that time, they were married, and Wanda, and then they put in brackets Bloom. That's because they divorced, and she later married a man named Bloom. So she was acting as secretary for the session. No changes were made in the bylaws at the session. Now, you can go back and read earlier in this. The bylaws were very, very simple. They weren't like the ones at Mount Dale and Waco today, these long, drawn-out, corrupted documents. But so there's records of those. So no changes in the bylaws. Some of the items of business, okay, here's where it's important, discussed at the session were accepting seven members from the Salem, South Carolina area, when to make a move of our headquarters to Salem, South Carolina, and then how much to spend on repairs and upkeep of the buildings in Salem, and then a hearing for Cecil Hellman and Nancy Zeller. Now, you can continue reading through this historical document, but they talk about the move from California to Salem, but any mention about going east? No, none, zero. So this is significant. So we're looking for evidence that they moved to Salem in 1970 on the basis of Ezekiel 47. We can't find any. Okay? Now, this is what's significant. They moved to Salem in 1970. Later, in 1973, Don Adair took over. He had a voting bloc come to South Carolina from California, where he had been working as a Bible worker, and they voted and nominated him to become vice president in 1973. And that's an absolute fact. And a lot of brethren back in California opposed Salem doctrines. Now, we have copies of these documents. Now, here's a letter, 2-page letter, written January 8, 1974, to the Executive Council at Salem. And at that time, it was Don Adair vice president, okay? And you can go to that that inside report of Davidian. It gives the members of that council. But Don Adair was heading this thing. And this is a formal document that shows the split, that they were opposing Don Adair's teachings and what he was doing at Salem. And they reorganized back in Yucaipa. So this is a significant document. Now, they list 3 main things. I want to just highlight the one in number 1, in yellow there. They're calling for him to retract, to repudiate the private interpretations or constructions, theories, and ideas, based on Answer Book 4, page 69, that was printed in the last 2 symbolic codes, Volume 12, number 2, and Volume 12, number 3, both published in 1973. So whatever's in there, they were opposing it. And then you have down here a list of 12 signatories. And so this split in 1974 is extremely significant. You cannot overlook this. What was Don Adair teaching in those symbolic codes? Now, we have a whole video on hijacking symbolic codes, unauthorized codes. It's not just Florence Houteff and her new codes, but any symbolic codes after the death of Brother Houteff are all unauthorized, and they've all been hijacked and been used as a means to introduce heterodoxy or winds of doctrine. So Salem is no different. So their so-called symbolic codes, Volume 12, number 2, and Volume 12, 2 and 3, are the ones. Now, I've been looking for years. I want to see what's in those things. Now, we haven't located a copy, but fortunately, we have evidence what Don Adair was teaching in there. Now, this list of people, it included Brother Ward and his wife, Sidney Smith. Who else is? Erwin Reichman, Wanda Bloom. They later split with Yucaipa in 1983 over a dispute about corrupting or changing the literature. Wanda or Howard Bloom, that's who she, of course, her, I guess, second or third husband, I don't know. But this is significant, okay? Eleanor Sorensen, she passed away recently. Most of these people are all past now. So what was it that Donna Dare was teaching that they were opposing? Well, fortunately, we have some illustrations. Now, Donna Dare takes these illustrations, which you can get from the Salem website, and it was common. He would go to the computer and create these, but this whole idea about going east, okay, this comes from Donna Dare illustrations and publications, okay, that he's published for decades. So these are no secrets, but we just show you two here. One of this idea that the message arose from the east, Portland, Maine, and then settled down in the west. They arrived in California in 1929, and then it went from, moved from California to Waco in 1935. Brother Houteff dies, and then the argument, then it jumped to Salem in 1970. The literature was reprinted. Now, there's some truth in that. The publishing work did relocate to Salem in 1970, and they kept alive the original literature, but was it on the basis of going east? Well, that teaching came from Donna Dare, and here's another illustration showing this whole idea of three locations of headquarters. The original rod in California in 1930, Waco, Texas, the tracts and the rest of the rod message under Brother Houteff, and then Salem 1970. And this is all consistent with going east. So these ideas, these concepts, come from Donna Dare. Now, do we accept them as universal truth, or do we dare challenge them? Well, it's interesting that brethren back in the day challenged them, and here is proof. California brethren oppose Salem's doctrines. Now, here's a detailed letter that's several pages. I'm just going to show you the first page and then one page in the middle. But this was published June, July 1974, and this was announced to Davidian brethren throughout the world, mainly in the U.S., but the reasons why they were reorganizing back in Yucaipa and opposing Donna Dare. So what were the issues? Well, they're spelled out here. And on this page, one of them is going west, the arguments that Donna Dare was using to come up with this going east doctrine. So it's spelled out right here. So that was one of the things, and they cite the source of it was Symbolic Code, Salem Symbolic Code, Volume 12, Number 2, and then later on in Number 3. So Donna Dare was introducing his own private inspired ideas about going east in those symbolic codes. So you know exactly what it was. Now they bring up other things. You can read this whole document. You can download it. I'll send you a copy. You can read it. One of the other issues was they're making the argument that the Executive Council had total authority to decide what is taught and what's truth. Now that's a fallacy. Bingham did it. The General Conference does it through the Biblical Research Institute. Mount Dale and Waco continue it. They think that their biblical research committees can decide what's truth and error, and that is an absolute fallacy. That's decided by the individual, not by an unauthorized committee of men. Okay, we've done a video on that, that the BRC or the BRI, which was developed by the General Conference for the specific purpose of opposing the shepherd's rod back in the 1940s. Okay, this is where they got the idea from. This is not how we determine points of doctrine. Okay, but this is perpetuated amongst various Davidian groups. So Donna Dare was following this trend, which he hint learned from Bingham. Bingham wanted total control of the publishing work and decide what's truth and error. Donna Dare co-opted the idea. So these brethren in California are going, and they give their good, strong reasons. So this is an extremely important historical document, why they were opposing, but it proves that the origin of the going east doctrine was not the reason they moved to Salem in 1970, but it was the thing cooked up by Donna Dare to justify Salem, starting in 1973, once he got control of the publishing work. So now you know some more of the facts, or the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. So what are some conclusions we can get from this? Historical analysis. The arguments about having to have an association, i.e. a GADSDA/headquarters east of Waco, Texas, originated from the teachings of Don Adair and first appeared in the Salem Symbolic Codes in 1973. That is volume 12, number 2. This is an irrefutable fact. It did not come from the brethren that were in California. They did not go to Salem in 1970 on the basis of Ezekiel 47. I used to think that. Now I stand corrected. It had nothing to do with it. The reasons are plainly stated in documents. So this thing was cooked up by Don Adair to justify Salem until his dying breath. Now, he passed away last summer, but there are still people hanging on to those false doctrines. They should jettison them because they have no basis in reality. Opposition to this doctrine and other teachings led to a split and a reorganization of faithful Davidians back in Yucaipa, California. Brother Warden being one of them, and Brother Sidney Smith being another. Now, come on, friends. These people were not all foolish. I mean, they were well-studied brethren, okay? And the idea that Don Adair had all the truth is just absolutely nonsense. He always would justify that, we here at headquarters at Salem are the only ones that have the truth. I studied with him for 9 months. I know. I was indoctrinated by that type of thinking. But it's the Ellen White councils. We have what? Many things to learn and many to unlearn. So we have to weed out these preconceived ideas and brainwashing doctrines we've been exposed to for decades. Friends, okay? So I myself have had to do that on so many things. Now, on other doctrines that Don Adair introduced, one that's a big one is the doze with. He introduced that later. And, of course, the idea that there are more than 144,000 saved alive from Seventh-day Adventist Church is patently false. But you would think that people wouldn't fall for that. But Bashan teaches it. Don Adair teaches it. There are other groups. Samuel Gonzalez and his counterfeit GADSDA and back in Waco, they teach it. Lennox Sam teaches it. So, yeah, the influence of Don Adair on whipping up false doctrines that deceive Davidians is quite extensive. Okay, when Mount Dale merged with Yucaipa Brethren in 1986, okay, the printing press, they reorganized back in Yucaipa. They brought that back to New York in 1986. Many of them, not all, continued with the Adair doctrine about going east, as it suited their location. Now, you're talking about the group of Davidians that were under Salem and Don Adair that he cast out. Okay, Norman Archer, Anthony Hibbert, and others. So they still hung on to the idea of going east. It's interesting that the Yucaipa Brethren were opposed to it. I remember Sister Bonnie saying, that's a Don Adair doctrine. Well, now we know why. It's true. They were opposing it because it wasn't in the rod. Those that were part of Yucaipa recognized that. So going forward, when I was in Mount Dale, I noticed that there was division. Some were into the going east, others were not. Now Mount Dale split later, of course, and I don't know, they probably still stand on the going east, the ones that are still left in Mount Dale. Now it's interesting, Norman Archer and others split off of Mount Dale in 1991. They reversed the course about going east doctrine. They said, no, it's not relevant anymore, and they began to claim that the fountain in Ezekiel 47 would not be open till the kingdom. So they're still duped by Don Adair, influenced by his teaching, so they have to counteract it. But in so doing, then they counteract the very message itself, the idea that the fountain isn't open today. Okay, and they cherry pick a reference out of 1 TG 18 about the fountain the cleansing fountain being opened, the house of David, after the house of David set up. That's true. But there's also a fountain open as a teeny rivulet before that. And there are clear references, Ellen White, in her day, that fountain was open. And the going east of, from California to Waco by Brother Houteff was on the basis of Ezekiel 47. It's in the old code, so you can't deny that. The fountain was open as a teeny rivulet starting in 1844. So that's where Waco gets in trouble. Since there's no clear instructions, here's the bottom line. That this is the earth-shaking one. I want you to think about this. Since there's no clear instruction or authorization in the original Shepherd's Rod to have a GADSDA or / headquarters after 1955, the whole argument about going east or not is totally irrelevant. Sit back and think about it. These different groups are arguing going east to either justify themselves or claim it's not relevant on the basis of false theology that came out of the head of Don Adair. If that's not true, then the question is their whole arguments about having to have an association and headquarters is null and void. We're in a scattering time. The future gospel headquarters is in Palestine, as we know, not Tacoma Park, Maryland, or Mount Carmel Center, but it's in Palestine. That's where we should be headed. So, of course, we advocate to solve the problem today. We don't need any of this political corruption, voting and nominating for vice presidents, no president, all of that madness and nonsense that was cooked up by Florence Houteff. We don't have to subject to it because it's all false. We can set up publishing houses around the world and let the brethren organize locally. So there is an answer to this. It's really simple. So we don't have to enter into this foray of, uninspired madness. So let's set ourselves free from the winds of doctrine cooked up by Don Adair and going east. And rather than trying to justify it or fight against it, let's just say that we're in a scattering period. Let's help brethren set up publishing houses to reach 22 million Adventists, 7-day Adventists around the world. And guess what? Most of them are in the other side of the world, i.e. Africa, Asia, Indonesia, Inter-American Division, that is Caribbean islands. It's not like it was back in Brother Houteff's day, where most Adventists are in North America. Now it's totally different. So this whole thing about fighting for a location of headquarters in the U.S. is total nonsense. At any rate, I hope that got your attention. Please check the box there. You can contact us by that email or that number. You can call, text, or connect with us on WhatsApp. And all of the documentation that I've shown you in the study, we will gladly share that with you without cost or obligation, and you can read it and confirm for yourself that I'm not cooking up fables here, but just going based on what the evidence shows us. So it's so important to understand these splits, this reorganization in 61, the movement to Salem in 1970, and the reasons why, and then the split with Ukaipa in 1974, and then the merger with Mount Dale in 1986, and then the split with Waco in 1991. Understand the basis what they did these things, but don't read into it something that's not there. And let us be done with these private, uninspired ideas coming from the arm of flesh, in particular Don Adair and M.J. Bingham and others. So we hope that you've been blessed. May God richly bless you as you search for truth as for hidden treasure and to cease from all men whose breath is in their nostrils. Until we meet again, Godspeed.